to, and so on. And interestingly enough, this occurred at the same time as a group of people very much opposed to these people embraced this homogenized identity. So this book was made possible by three really big new waves of scholarship that took place during the last 5 or 6 years within academic settings, within think tanks, within government agencies, and so on, looking at population growth rates, integration patterns, and the roots of extremism, which are the sort of core parts of the empirical section of this book. Population, I think, was almost what got me started on this, because it was where I first noticed that things known to scholars were very much at odds with popular belief. It is widely held that the reason why I'm calling it the Muslim tide idea is that one of the core ideas is that they have a lot of children and we don't, and therefore they're going to swamp us. That's an underlying sort of assumption behind much of this literature. And you couldn't really say much about it until 5 or 6 years ago, when we started to get fine enough grained empirical work on demographics that was able to isolate specific immigrant communities within the West with large enough sample sizes that we could actually talk about what was happening. And we've had a number of pieces of work from different agencies, from UN agencies, from groups like Pew, from academic groups that create the same pattern. I mean, we know that the countries that they're coming from, which is not the subject of my study, are experiencing the fastest fall in fertility and population growth rates of any group of countries in the world. Muslim countries are. Iran is the outstanding example. Went from having more than 7 children per family in the 1980s to having 1.7 children per family now, a smaller family size than France. Turkey, similarly, has fallen to below the population growth rate, below 2.1 children per family. Lebanon, 1.9, Tunisia, 2.0. Indonesia is barely above the population growth rate. And even Bangladesh, which was regarded as a population growth horror story a few years ago, is now very quickly approaching European population growth rates. So you have this secularization of Muslim fertility in the countries that they're coming from, a dissociation of sexual and family planning practices from the old traditions and from religion and so on, even as religious politics rises. Some argue that religious politics rises because of the secularization of family life and so on. But what happens when they immigrate? Because immigrants have large families. And we see that around us and so on. This is a universal truth of most immigrants, but you see a lot of Muslim families with large numbers in them, and there were figures suggesting that there are huge families in places like the Netherlands and Britain and so on. And first of all, yes, immigrants tend to have large families after they arrive. There's a bit of a data error in it, in that when you look at the large family sizes, which are expressed as total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is calculated by taking the number of children a woman has had and projecting it across her entire fertile lifespan. The problem that they've identified in the last few years is that immigrants tend to have a whole bunch of children right after arriving for a number of fairly obvious reasons. Because they become economically stable and they have a secure home and so on. And that cluster of children soon after arriving gets projected across the fertile lifespan of the women involved, and you end up with a grossly exaggerated total fertility rate for new immigrants. And studies in Germany and Britain have shown that the more extreme sounding numbers are exaggerated. In North America, Muslims in general tend to be new immigrants who've arrived again since 1990, so they do have a higher than average fertility growth rate. Nevertheless, what we're seeing in North America and in Europe and everywhere else is the same pattern that was followed by Southern European Catholics and Eastern European Jews, which was to have large families in the first generation, family sizes in the second generation that are much closer to those of the average Western population, and family sizes in the third generation that are extremely close, and so on. And we're seeing that. I mean, The British-born children of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in Britain have family sizes that are just barely above the British average. In France, where there's been a Muslim population of substantial size since the early 60s, you see an almost total convergence and so on. And to the point that projections that Muslims will become a majority in Europe, as many of these books say, within 30 years or 50 years or whatever, or in some European country, are demonstrably false. That it is not mathematically or demographically possible for Muslims to become more than about 10% of the population of any European country before the point at mid-century where all populations will start falling and so on. So the peak in a few countries like Austria will be just shy of 10% if current immigration rates are kept high and so on. In Canada, there could be as much as 7 or 8% Muslim population before things sort of peak and so on. And in the United States, Muslims may reach the same population numbers as Jews and Episcopalians, so somewhere under 3%, at which point you're going to run out of sources for people and so on. These are the countries that are sending the people are having collapsing fertility rates and so on, or reaching what I call peak people, where the supply is going to start hitting its downward curve, and there will be a demand panic for immigrants and so on. That's another story, though. The second area is integration, and this is a nebulous area because what does integration mean? For some people, it means fitting into the economy and the education system. For some people, it means adopting the values of the country around us. For some people in the popular imagination, it means something closer to assimilation, that is, adopting the religion and becoming identical to the people around us. From what I've found, I would say that, generally speaking, when a new immigrant group becomes integrated into the workforce, into the economy, and into the education system, particularly the post-secondary education system, that cultural integration tends to follow directly from that. Culture tends to be a product rather than a cause in these things. But we can start with the questions of loyalties, because that's the most interesting one. Because the integration in economic terms and in terms of certain values varies a lot texturally across the Western world, even for people from the same countries. And one of the exercises I've done with integration is to follow people who come from the same rural villages in, say, Anatolia in Turkey, and where one person from the village has moved to the outskirts of Istanbul. I did this in my first book, A Rival City. Another person from the village has moved to London, and another family from the village has moved to Berlin. And in the case where I looked at that, well, the families who moved to the outskirts of Istanbul went through the violent and tricky process that rural to urban migrants did in the 70s and 80s, but then became part of the dominant Turkish new middle class that currently is the governing class. Those who moved to London became merchants and shopkeepers and so on, usually bought housing at the right point and so on. Their kids had some post-secondary success and became part of the fabric of London. I lived in one of those Turkish neighborhoods, people from those villages. Those who moved to Germany became integration failures and part of a parallel society who weren't learning German and were more religious than their parents and were seen by the media as a threat to German society and so on. How is it that three families from the same village can have those different integration outcomes and so on? And there's a lot of work on this, showing that the patterns of integration, no matter how you measure it, of people from the same place vary completely depending what country they arrive in, which tells you a couple of things. It tells you that it's not the culture that they're coming from, and it's not their religion that's causing failed integration when it happens. It's something on the receiving end or in the interface between their originating culture and the receiving culture, and so on. Nobody immigrates hoping to completely keep the life and patterns of life that they came from. It tends to be a hybrid on the ground between new and old, often for some time, often for a couple generations. In terms of loyalty, though, what's interesting is that some of the most poorly integrated immigrants are the most loyal to the country that they've arrived in, and so on. There's been a lot of work done on the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis of northern England, who are among the great integration failures of Europe by many measures. Their workplace performance, their employment rate performance, poverty rate performance is very poor. They have a set of social values about women and homosexuals and so on that are deeply at odds with those of the world around them and so on. Interestingly though, and this is not just some study that does this, but a whole series of bits of work on this by different organizations show that those Muslims of northern England are the most loyal to Britain and its institutions, including the army and police, more so actually than Anglican British people are, and so on. And which shows that you can be fairly far out of step and still not be a threat to the society around you. You have a loyalty to it. You may want to form a parallel society, yet not be disloyal at all. I mean, I've lived in several neighborhoods full of Hasidic Jews who live a lifestyle and wear clothing that seems centuries out of step with the country around me. In Britain, in London and Los Angeles, I lived nearby to Hasidic neighborhoods. And yet, of course, by many measures, they're an integration success story. Their children do well in university. They're very loyal to the country. Nobody would suggest they're a threat. There are patterns like that with Muslims who simply choose to be religiously conservative and so on. In terms of other forms of integration, educationally, it's really varied. In the United States, Muslims are among the most successful educational groups. They are the second most successful religious group in terms of post-secondary performance after Jews and ahead of any Christian group, and so on. And in Canada, it tends to vary from nationality to nationality, but it's fairly similar. Europe, you tend to have groups who come from very poor backgrounds because the labor shortages in Europe were generally in low-skilled and semi-skilled areas. So if you're Moroccan and you live in Europe, your parents are probably from the Rif Mountains, which is a very poor goat farming area. If you're from Turkey, probably from central Anatolia or the southeast. If you're from Pakistan, 90% of British Pakistanis are from this, not from any major city, but from this tiny area of Kashmir that has no cities. More than 90% of British Bangladeshis come not from Dhaka, but from Sylhet, which is an entirely rural province in the north, and so on. So Europe's Muslims are experiencing both a culture shock and a rural to urban migration of fairly profound magnitude at the same time, and so on. So you do get a set of integration problems which are difficult. You can do a control group thing with this and point out that immigrants to Europe from equally deprived rural backgrounds actually have pretty similar integration problems, similar propensity to extremism, and so on. In the Netherlands, it tends to be Moroccans, not so much Turks anymore, and people from the former Dutch colonies of Christian background who have pretty much identical patterns, and so on. You often see similar patterns, as in Sweden, between North African Muslims and people from the Balkans of Orthodox or Catholic background, and so on. So you see these things. And I'm not going to get into all the details on integration because it's a complex topic, but one interesting thing is that when Muslims, when they immigrate to Western countries, tend to fall to the level of religiosity of the country around them. I was initially shocked to find that something like 46% of American Muslims say, I'm Muslim first and American second, which I don't particularly like. I don't like the idea of somebody saying that their religion is more important, except for the fact that among American Christians, 46% say they're Christian first and American second, and 70% say religion is the key thing in their lives, and so on. If you go to France, Muslims in France, and they're pretty well studied actually academically, even though they're not allowed to keep statistics on them in France, have reached a level of religiosity very similar to the French population. But 1 in 5 French Muslims has no religious observance whatsoever, and is effectively atheist in practice. They probably wouldn't use that word, which is about the same rate as among French Christians, and so on. And views of homosexuality, and in France, they study a lot views of extramarital sexual relations are surprisingly close among Muslims as with non-Muslims. In France, that's regarded, I think, as the ultimate badge of civilization, is to accept an extramarital affair. I think what's important is that what we see in things like attitudes toward homosexuals. I mean, 39% of US Muslims say that homosexuality should be accepted, which is lower than the 58% acceptance rate among Americans in general. But the important thing is that it is a whole world of difference from the attitude toward homosexuals in the countries from which they and their parents emigrated, which you typically see numbers like 2 or 3% and that sort of thing. What this indicates is not that there's an instant assimilation going on or something like that, but that people are broadly abandoning the worldviews of the place from which they and their parents came and are adopting ones that are at least somewhat similar to the world around them. Integration never is a perfectly, coming the same thing. I don't think we'd ever want that. The fear of the Roman Catholic from Southern Europe was that they would remain a perpetually alien people. And as late as 1950, and certainly in 1930, they seemed to be a completely alien group from another civilization within our midst. Canadian government officials in the early 1950s were saying that Italians should not be accepted as immigrants because they are so civilizationally different from us, and so on. What's the legacy? They remain Roman Catholic. They have family sizes that are actually pretty similar to the average Canadian family size, despite having 9 children per family then. They have post-secondary rates that are slightly below, but within a similar range of regular Canadians. And we can all name more than 2 types of pasta, and we drink espresso all the time, and so on, much as we dot our conversations with Yiddish phrases and all this sort of thing. And these are not the patterns that we're seeing of a self-isolating parallel society, but of people struggling to become Western as the people around them as far as core values are concerned, and trying to find their place and so on. What it suggests is that including the problems with integration, that immigrants from Muslim countries are following the pattern that Eastern European Jews and Southern European Catholics did, including second generation that doesn't quite seem as educated or integrated as the first generation, including propensities to join gangs and things like this, and so on. That doesn't mean there aren't problems that need to be dealt with through policy and so on, that there aren't threats, but that we should not regard this as being a new phenomenon. We have forgotten what religious minority immigration is like because it had been a number of generations since the previous wave of it, previous much larger wave. Finally, extremism. And this is the question that always follows the one about integration. Yes, that's all fine, but there are definitely some who become violent extremists and blow themselves up. There are guys from Chechnya who blow themselves up at the Boston Marathon. And are we allowing in a group who carry with them some sort of core belief that causes some of them to become violent extremists and so on? Another legitimate question, I would argue. Another one that we would have had a lot of trouble answering until quite recently. We've seen a lot of very large-scale studies coming from intelligence agencies like MI5, from scholarly groups in Belgium and the Netherlands and so on, and in Britain, who've looked at hundreds and hundreds of extremists and their supporters, and from think tanks and so on. We have a wide range of data now on what causes people to become extremists and what the origins and views of extremists are within the Muslim community. And in terms of core beliefs, almost every book of this Muslim Tide literature repeats a study from a few years ago that shows that 7% of US Muslims feel that acts of violence against civilian targets are sometimes justified, and another 1% feel they're often justified, so 8%, which I found a chilling figure and alarmed me to think that, nearly 1 in 10 Muslims thinks that violence against civilians can be acceptable. But if you actually go back to the study, you find that 24% of non-Muslim Americans feel that such attacks are sometimes justified, and 6% feel they're often justified, and so on. So in fact, the rate of support for attacks against civilians among American Muslims is a tiny fraction of support among non-Muslim Americans, possibly because Muslims tend to be the victims of that form of violence, and so on. Generally, support for violence, honor killings and death penalties and things like that among Muslims in the West are exactly the same as or even slightly lower than those among the general population. There is no widespread support for violence as stated by people. There's also no widespread support for Sharia law as most broadly defined anyway, except sometimes within their own faith. Some people would like to have religious weddings and divorces in all three of the Abrahamic religions, and so on. But a desire to have this become part of the world around you does not have support among people. But what about the terrorists themselves? Where do they come from? And this is where we have a large amount of information now. That all the studies show that the places that are producing people who become violent extremists, supporters of violent extremism or terrorism, are not the most religious communities and are not the immigrant communities. The typical person who becomes an extremist, and this is very strongly supported in all the data, is somebody who's middle class, who does not come from an immigrant enclave, who has a decent amount of education, who tends to be one of the few Muslims in a generally non-Muslim area, and so on, and is not an immigrant, is either a child or a grandchild of immigrants probably, or a convert, and so on. In other words, while we should still be worried about the roots of extremism, it's not being produced by immigration or its communities, and it's not being produced by the most extreme religion. And this has been examined both ways. First of all, if scholars who've looked at the most religious communities, the most devout communities of Muslims, find that they have the lowest rates of producing extremists. Scholars who've looked at extremists and what got them into it have found that it's almost never strong religious belief. It's a political movement. It's a political movement that uses the language of religion. Certainly by the time someone becomes indoctrinated to be an extremist, they have some version of a Salafist faith and so on. But they are not coming into it through religion. Overwhelmingly not. And it's not very much a religious movement. I mean, there was a big study last year looking at the Quranic passages quoted by 2,000 Islamic terrorists and their supporters. And almost none of it suggested a desire to convert the West or any other place in the world to Islam. Entirely nationalistic in nature. These quotations were based on preserving a separate Islamic world, a separate Islamic sphere, and so on. It's a territorial political movement, much as previous territorial political movements, based on defending the turf against the invader, and so on. And it's no coincidence that the Muslim Tide authors, such as Thilo Sarrazin in Germany, Christopher Caldwell in the United States, often express admiration for fundamentalist, for extremist groups like this. They share the same core belief that there is a distinct Western civilization and a distinct land of Islam, that if their people come into touch with each other, they will destroy each other, that their own civilizations, whether the Islamic civilization or the Western civilization, are so weak and so ineffectual that having contact with the other group is going to destroy their core values and their fundamental aspects. Anders Breivik, who got me started on this project by killing 70 people in the name of anti-multiculturalism, as he called it, was a great admirer of Osama bin Laden in his 1,500-page manifesto, not just as an organizational genius, as a tactical genius, but as somebody whose core beliefs he completely agreed with. This idea that these two worlds will never be compatible with each other, that the only way to prevent their contact with each other from causing destruction of our civilization was by killing the traitors who allowed this to take place. That core belief, shared by jihadis and by many of these authors, is what I'm calling a myth here, and that is at the core of what I'm trying to show is the problem around us. That it's a recurring belief that if we allow it to recur again in its full magnitude, could be very dangerous in the world around us, and we need to start looking at facts rather than myths. Thank you very much.